coming. We are starting and getting everything done and ready to go. Gretchen, can you switch the slide for me? We're going to take care of a few housekeeping items, which basically is just letting you know that this will be recorded. And if you have any questions, we're asking everybody to drop them in the chat box. Jerome has a hard stop today, so we are going to do what we can to get through all of the material and the questions. We will try to answer them if there's a time in the place, if it works out, or if we just hold them to the end. But the great thing about it is if we do not get to your question, we're inviting you to engage with Jerome in our a live group in LinkedIn where you can reach out to him directly and interact with him and engage with him. So do not dismay. If we don't get to your question, there's still plenty of time to interact with him afterwards. Um, I just wanted to again thank you all so much to tell you about our special guest, Jerome. He works for Marriott International on their social impact team, but he's also worked in the nonprofit sector for almost 6 years prior. He's recently joined the Governor's Commission for the state of Maryland, and of course, he is a CVA. I can't wait to get mine. Um, and I have to always give a shout out and say thank you for your service. He is a Navy veteran, and he is going to be talking to us today about creating a more diverse, inclusive environment through mechanisms that engage volunteers. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed guest, Jerome.
Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Nicole. I'm going to go ahead and get into sharing my screen. As you did mention, I do have a hard stop, unfortunately, but I do certainly encourage people to connect with me beyond today's presentation. This is a topic that has oftentimes it requires more than 90 minutes. This is a lifelong pursuit of making progress at every stage that we can. And by the end of this presentation, you won't be an expert, but hopefully this plants a seed and gives sort of an introduction on the steps that you might choose to take beyond today. All right, so with that said, I'm going to share a little bit about myself. I think, I've been a member of Alive for a couple of years now, but not everybody is familiar with who I am. So my name is Jerome Tennille. I am a social impact consultant, and I've been working to create volunteer engagement, DEI, and sustainability strategies for both nonprofit organizations and companies on their corporate responsibility teams for the greater part of 10 years. And on the next slide, I'll just share a little bit more about myself because I think that'll help paint a more clear understanding of who I am as an individual as we talk through this conversation and topic. All right, so for starters, as Nicole mentioned, I did serve in the military for about 8 years. And, for me as a professional, I became very purpose and duty driven, which led me into the nonprofit sector after I transitioned from military service. I began a career in the nonprofit sector as a volunteer coordinator at the lowest level you could possibly imagine at a national nonprofit here in the United States. And over the years, I became very passionate about the work that I did and have dedicated my my life's work to volunteer engagement. I did earn my CVA and will be renewing this year. Now I work in corporate responsibility for a Fortune 500 company, managing their global volunteer program. Academically, I have a heavy focus on sustainability, and I also really seek to incorporate non-traditional practices into the daily work that I do. Some of that I think can actually be gleaned or read in my blog. It's called Responsible AF, which is on my personal website, jerometennille.com. But beyond my personal blog, I also have written for other outlets like Volunteer Match, Impactor Magazine, and Business to Community Magazine, which is much more focused on the business community. All right, so today's presentation is titled, creating a more diverse and inclusive environment through the mechanisms that engage volunteers. I happen to think that, as a society, we often focus, in my opinion, too much on the acts of being more inclusive, but as a result, I think we often forget about why our systems aren't inclusive in the first place. So in efforts to not just rush to solve issues that we don't automatically understand, I always think that we have to first acknowledge and identify the invisible forces that create unintended discriminatory practices where we both engage volunteers and work. Sometimes these barriers, in my opinion, they are, in my opinion, being influenced by centuries old social and cultural norms. And I think only after we're able to identify and acknowledge that, then we can really work to overcome some of the barriers that I think have been created. And just, on a final note, this presentation, again, it does focus a lot on historical context. There's a quote that I love, and you'll see it later on in this presentation, but it's, history repeats itself endlessly for those who are unwilling to learn from the past. And, in the spirit of not rushing to solve issues that we don't understand, I feel strongly that we have to understand where we came from first. And also, as people have questions, again, put them in a chat box. We have a point within the presentation that we'll stop to answer the chat field. And then at the very end, we certainly have the Q&A. All right, so here's a look at today's objectives. This is being recorded, so I'm not going to go through each of these for the sake of time, but essentially we'll be diving into the historical context of volunteerism and the nonprofit sector, and how that might be influencing how we currently engage our volunteers, and some practices that we can take and to also just be considered about as we're creating volunteer opportunities. All right, so, as we begin, I also feel very strongly that I have to preface this presentation with my own sort of personal statement on this. For me, the views and the opinions that I'm expressing today are my own as an individual. Through this presentation, while we'll be exploring the time period of nearly 300 years that shaped volunteerism, I have to acknowledge that what I cover today is a simplification of really complex issues. I also have to acknowledge that I'll be naming several longstanding nonprofit organizations, one as a part of a mini case study that we will reference several times through the presentation, but in no way am I calling these organizations bad. And I am not at all suggesting that any action be taken against them. I also want to be clear and share that in no way am I seeking to discourage people from volunteering. I've spent the greater part of 10 years trying to advance the culture of volunteerism, as this is my chosen profession. I want volunteering to continue, but it's also important to me that volunteers continue learning about diverse communities. And lastly, I believe strongly that, when done very thoughtfully, volunteer engagement can positively build cultural understanding and community cohesion. But we have to first, be mindful that all of that can be undone if volunteer engagement is done in a way that only reinforces what I've seen described as white supremacy or colonial power structures that oftentimes only perpetuate the inequities that we're trying to that we're trying to solve for. All right, now, as we get into this, I feel strongly that, I'm a big believer of definitions, and I just want to level set by pointing out that the differences between diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism. Over the past year, I've seen both of these terms used quite loosely, but they are different. DEI, it refers to the demographic variation within your organizational staff, both paid and unpaid. DEI is the proactive measure of hiring or engaging diverse people. DEI does not commit to disrupting racial oppression from a structural perspective. Now, on the other hand, anti-racism is different in that it's the proactive practice of scrutinizing systemic racial bias within our society. It's a proactive stance to identify and dismantle racial bias that's inherent within our workplace culture, policies, the practices, and it actively confronts the root causes of disparities, some of which we'll talk about today. And while these are connected, they are slightly different, but they're also mutually supportive actions. All right. I start with that because I believe understanding the difference is important, because as we continue, we'll discuss the roles and missions of many nonprofit organizations and how their structures may undermine the critical work that they're seeking to accomplish. In a pre-COVID environment, there were close to 1.5 million nonprofits that were registered with the IRS. And while there are many estimates that I think that we have all seen that project that anywhere between 30 to 40% of these organizations may never recover from this economic downturn, it doesn't change the fact that many of these same organizations are chartered to serve populations and communities suffering from great disparities of wealth, income, health, hunger, and education. But when we think about injecting practices that could be understood as being anti-racist into the fabric of our institutions, in my opinion, the first anti-racist practice is really just to look inwards. I believe that for an advocacy organization to scrutinize the systems they're charged for or charged to advocate for, they have to first look within themselves. They have to look inward to acknowledge that any racial bias that might be within their policies or their organizational culture first, to be effective at the advocacy work that they're making progress on. And I think it's also within the responsibility of staff and leadership to understand how their institution was socially constructed, and perhaps how it's been used to maybe even subjugate groups, and how that shows up within our organizations, even in modern times. And so with that said, we're going to take a look at some milestones within the history of volunteering and nonprofit organizations here in the United States. All right, so while volunteering isn't a new concept that's unique to the United States, I have to point out the context in which we value and understand the act of volunteering as a Western nation. Culturally, volunteering isn't universally understood or valued globally, and the very culture, socially and religiously, here in America has ultimately shaped our view of volunteerism. The roots of volunteering, or essentially the act of giving one's time to others, it can actually be traced all the way back to Benjamin Franklin and his establishing the first volunteer firehouse in the early 1700s. And while this can be considered one of the first forms of formalized volunteerism, which to me is a major accomplishment, we have to understand the period in which this took place. 1736, it was a year that was still during the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was one of the three major religious revival movements that was sweeping across Europe and here in the original colonies. And unfortunately, this was still during a time of slavery, where it was still believed that the color of your skin determined if you were pure or if you were criminalistic. Those who were white or Caucasian or light-skinned, they were automatically married to Christianity and being pure. And the darker your skin, your quote unquote blackness was coupled with criminalistic behavior, or having a soul that needed to be saved. And I share this because, as we continue and we look through our history and into the second and even the third Great Awakening, which spanned another 200 years, from the 1700s to the 1900s, early 1900s, it was during this period that gave birth to some of the longest running volunteer institutions that are still here with us today. Many of these organizations I've volunteered with or have seen, and I suspect many of you have as well, like the YMCA, American Red Cross, Salvation Army, even the United Way. A lot of these organizations were founded in the 1800s, some of which in a post-Civil War society. Now, beyond the Great Awakening, and as we sort of fast forward into the 20th century and more modern times, volunteering, it became much more mainstream as an activity to support many different causes. Throughout the 1900s, organizations like Rotary Club, Kiwanis, and Lions Club were all established, and these organizations are still here today. Volunteers of America was born from the Great Depression. And then there was this explosion of volunteering as a nation as we turned to the war on poverty, or what was called the war on poverty in the 1960s. Unfortunately, it was really around that time frame that the progress that was being made against poverty actually came to a halt. And I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. But you see, there were many organizations that were, they were founded to solve critical issues of poverty and food insecurity and many others. But we have to also be honest in acknowledging that their good intentions always didn't result in a positive impact, right? This is something I speak about quite often, but I believe that there's still a real dark side to volunteering that can oftentimes be the result of well-intentioned people rushing to solve issues that they don't immediately understand. And when this happens, some of the unintended actions included, historically imposing a very specific vision of right and wrong or good and bad onto other cultures. And this, of course, caused damage through actions similar to what I think many of us would consider volunteerism. The only difference is that, these actions are taking place here domestically. And all of these behaviors, I would suggest, are centuries old and really stem back to what could be considered as colonial power structures. I wrote a blog some years ago, and I still feel strongly about it today, but it's about the idea that nonprofit organizations are not socially responsible by default simply because they support a specific social or environmental issue. And this isn't to say that nonprofits are bad. It's just an acknowledgement that I think more can and should be done. It's just acknowledging that there are blind spots that exist within us as individuals and those who are founding these organizations. And in theory, the nonprofit sector is based on values of community, diversity, justice, integrity, equity, but there's still unintended harm that's being done by institutions that fail to recognize their own blind spots. And this, to me, is what we have to really get to the root of acknowledging, identifying, and then really working to take action to solve, which I think we'll talk about at the latter half of this presentation. Now, as we continue, again, we're going to take a look at a case study that I feel will paint the more of a clear picture of what I'm referring to. And we're going to talk about this organization here in the upcoming slides. It's Sierra Club. All right, so this past July, the Sierra Club, they did something that is often unheard of, especially in a nonprofit sector. They had their own self-reckoning this past summer, and they acknowledged the harm the organization has done through their own history of racist actions. They acknowledged and pointed to the racial prejudices of their founder, John Muir, who is an environmental icon. And it was, and they also acknowledged that it was through his actions and the work that he championed in the late 1800s that actually caused a lot of harm to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color for decades. Now, before we talk more deeply about Sierra Club and John Muir, I also have to acknowledge again that this self-reckoning of their harmful past. It does not, in my opinion, invalidate the work that they have accomplished over the decades. These are accomplishments that we'll talk about here shortly, but these are, society-based and environmentally based as well. And I think many of us will come to recognize that we're all benefiting from these things. All right, so John Muir, he founded Sierra Club in 1892, and some of the most notable work really includes their efforts to preserve the environment through the creation of what we now recognize as public parks. It's through their work that they were able to successfully promote clean water while also promoting renewable energy. They campaigned against coal, and they brought to life what we now consider youth environmental education. Even their body of work led to the establishment of what's now the National Park System. Unfortunately, that all came at a great cost. Now, again, John Muir, he was perceived as a national hero, and I think there are many who still consider him to be a national hero to this day. People have called him the father of our national parks and the wilderness prophet. He's even had many different establishments named after him for his environmental stewardship. There's been a high school, over 20 elementary schools, 6 middle schools, a college, a glacier, a forest, a mountain, a cabin, a hospital, a motel, even a small planet has been named after this man. And the list goes on, by the way. But, while many revere his work, I think it's also important that we acknowledge the harm that was caused to many others because of the work that he championed, or I should say how he championed it. John Muir, he was also considered a prolific writer, but it was in his writing that he actually characterized Black and Indigenous people as dirty and lazy. He even ignored the suffering of the Cherokee who walked the Trail of Tears, who were actually evicted from their land by way of the policy and laws based on his work. And, even the national park system to this day, it still displaces many indigenous tribes. Currently, if my numbers are correct, there's only a single Native American tribe that by law is allowed to reside within the boundaries of the national parks. And John Muir's philosophy and legacy, in his writing, he would uphold nature as being a cathedral and animals as small as microbes as being divine, in his words. Yet he regarded Native Americans as subhuman and unworthy of the land that was eventually stripped from them. You see, John Muir, he saw America's nature as a blank slate to create and form what now is the national park system. But in truth, nature was never a blank slate. His actions ignored the indigenous before him. And, again, this is just a single example of racist underpinnings that led to much of the organization's work. And again, while this is just one example, it doesn't, again, diminish the positive contributions that they've accomplished. They've accomplished quite a bit. I would also just say that, as we continue through this presentation, we'll even talk about some of the examples where the Sierra Club have implemented tools to reshape their internal structure while righting past wrongs, specifically focused on communities of color. But in my opinion, again, one of the underlying issues that's not unique to the Sierra Club is the historically significant racial leadership gap that exists within a nonprofit sector at large. It's estimated, and again, these are pre-COVID numbers, but it's estimated that close to 80% of the nonprofit sector senior leadership positions are held by those who are white or Caucasian or European descent. Long term, this leads to a homogeneous approach to solving problems. It lowers the chances that those in power might actually understand the concerns of diverse populations that they're serving. And this includes those that are working at this organization as employees, and also the communities that they're serving. But when you really step back and you look at the largest 315 mission-based nonprofits and foundations, that number actually increases. It goes higher than 90, or it goes higher to higher than 80%, and it becomes closer to 90% of senior leaders that are actually made up of white, Caucasian, and European descent. And this, again, in my estimation, has created a situation where people making decisions at organizations chartered to solve critical issues are all thinking too much alike as a result of a lack of inherent diversity at the top positions. And think about that as we transition into the next slide, and think about that as we start to think about even our own demographic makeup as a profession, because I think that that too influences how we are recruiting our volunteers. All right, so when many people think about white supremacy, I think we often think about an overt hate group, right? We think about neo-Nazis, the KKK, and all different other segments of racist organizations. But white supremacy doesn't always show up as a neo-Nazi or a Klansman. Many of you have probably seen a graphic very similar to this. This is what I would call the white supremacy spectrum, and it's not at all like this is not the end all be all. This is just a segment of what exists out there. But there's two different types of forms of racism, right? There's overt and a covert. The covert racism, this is a result of blind spots and biases that are unconscious and unintended. We all have them. And a lot of these biases and blind spots are molded by centuries of social, cultural, and religious ideals. But then when we think about overt racism, some examples, again, are those overt hate groups committing hate crimes, brandishing of the swastika, racist jokes, right? Those are things that are very obvious. Again, some of the lesser obvious or covert forms of white supremacy may show up as things like Eurocentric or English-only curriculum or initiatives in public schools, or designed by large entities. Some might even say that the celebration of Columbus Day is covert white supremacy because it ignores the suffering of indigenous people, right? So you can see that there's a spectrum that exists here. So we have to think about these very subtle or unconscious acts as forms of white supremacy. And we also have to think about that in terms of people of color, even sometimes perpetuating these unconscious acts because of centuries-old policy that even influence them and their own blind spots. And as we get through this presentation, I'll use myself as an example. All right, so here's how some people might very simply define white supremacy. In a very basic definition, it can be easily defined as white people having the most access to and control over money, resources, and people. I would even add control over thought onto this as well. I think we think about all these tangible things, but there are intangible things that I think could also be counted on this. Now think about that for a second, and the previous slide, when we talk about senior leadership that exists at the topmost levels of nonprofit organizations. And while I believe that those 80 to 90% of senior leaders are very sincere and well-intentioned with their leading and managing these organizations, we can't really ignore the potential for unintended harm as a result of potential blind spots. And these are not easy things to overcome. It's not as easy as just hiring more diverse leaders in positions of power. And we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but it's because a homogeneous environment only perpetuates the issue. And we're going to talk about that here in this next slide. All right, so here's a cycle that exists that creates a situation for nonprofits and foundations staying homogeneous. Over 80% of nonprofit staff leverage their own networks when recruiting new employees. I've done this, and I've seen many of my clients do this. It's estimated that 75% of white Americans have social networks that actually do not include a minority presence. And so this leads to a homogeneous applicant pool. Research has also shown that implicit bias just elevates the white applicants in that process. Additionally, research also suggests that applicants with white-sounding names are 50% more likely to get an interview than those with African-American sounding names. And before you bat an eye at that last statement, I want to plug a quick article that was recently written in Huffington Post, and it's titled, "I'm a Black woman who had to change her name to get ahead professionally." And it's written by an acquaintance of mine. Her name is C. Marie Taylor. She's a race equity consultant, and she's also the former CEO of Leadership Montgomery, which is a DC-based organization. And she highlights why she had to change her name to climb the ladder of leadership as a Black woman. And, lastly, as we get back to thinking about this cycle, research also indicates that white hiring managers may recommend the Black candidate less often than a white candidate with the exact same credentials. And just like that, while these things are very complicated, it's that type of cycle that perpetuates the issue. And now the cycle that I show here on this slide is very focused on human resources practicing, right, and how they hire. But there are a lot of things that we do in our own professions that is very similar to how we would essentially hire, onboard, train, staff, and communicate with our volunteer base. And so we have to be very mindful that we could be unintentionally perpetuating this homogenous cycle for our own volunteer base. All right, so now when we think back to Sierra Club, their current executive director, Michael Brune, he addressed who will constitute leadership at the Sierra Club going forward. And this was very deliberate on their part. In part, he publicly stated, quote, we are redesigning our leadership structure so that Black, Indigenous, and other leaders of color at the Sierra Club make up the majority of the team making top-level organizational decisions. We will institute similar changes to elevate the voices and experiences of staff of color across the organization. We know that the systems of power that got us here will not enable the transformational change that we need. And what Michael Brune was talking about is the decentering of historically dominant voices and elevating the voices of those who have historically been marginalized at the decision-making table for the organization. And this action by Sierra Club is one that I would note make up what I would consider another practice that could be considered anti-racist. They're incorporating the mindset to always be recruiting while also looking for top talent from communities of color. And secondly, they are going to actively elevate voices of color in the work that they do. Now, both of these ideas we'll talk about again in the latter half of the presentation. But again, this goes back to the idea of creating the space to allow those voices that have historically not had a voice, and being very deliberate about it. All right, so I want to take just a quick pause and a recap. So far, we've looked at what I would consider the history of volunteering and the context stemming from the 1700s and into the early 1900s. We talked a bit about the roots and how structural racism may exist within organizations as a result of homogenous thought. And we also scratched the surface on a case study that highlights what I would consider contributions to some of these inequities. But now I want to talk about something else, right? And this is something that I think that we have all seen within the last year, but topics around white supremacy culture and how it might show up in our own institutions as covert racism and some of the damaging behaviors that might follow as a result. All right, so at this stage, you might already be familiar with some of these characteristics because I think that they've been shared to a handful of circles, including MAVA. Lisa Joycelyn, she did a fantastic job at capturing many of these characteristics and then making them relatable to nonprofit work. So we're not going to spend too much time on these, but before we get into this, I want to share a quick paragraph from the original writers of this content. The late Kenneth Jones and Tima Oken, they have been the ones who have pioneered this for some decades now. But in sharing what they describe as characteristics of white supremacy, they preface all of that by saying, one of the purposes of listing characteristics of white supremacy culture is to point out how organizations which unconsciously use these characteristics as their norms and standards make it difficult, if not impossible, to open the door to other cultural norms and standards. As a result, many of our organizations, while saying we want to be multicultural, really only allow other people and cultures to come in if they adapt or conform to already existing cultural norms. Being able to identify and name the cultural norms and standards you want is a first step to making room for a truly multicultural organization. And one idea we'll revisit is that the idea of only allowing other people and cultures in only if they adopt to or conform to these already existing cultural norms that exist within our own organizations. All right, so I only chose some that I generally see more overtly in the nonprofit sector. So I only chose 4, but just to understand that there are close to 12 that actually exist. One that I think that we can actually immediately identify with as having seen is this idea of protectionism and defensiveness within a nonprofit sector. This may be seen within organizational structures where organizations focus heavily to project a certain amount of power, resources, and influence. But with the regard to individual leadership, it's often not appropriate in some instances to question the decisions by those who are an authority or in leadership. Sometimes within these same structures, there's even a higher value placed on making sure that the feelings of employees or volunteers aren't hurt. And that, as a result, it creates an environment where issues are sometimes just glossed over. And sometimes this characteristic, it shows up as a defensiveness of leadership and those in positions of authority that end up creating a situation where staff, both paid and unpaid, are oppressed. And when we think about protectionism over resources, how often, and I've been guilty of this too, is saying our volunteers, my volunteers, right? And we get into this situation where we are trying to protect that resource from other organizations or maybe even other programs and departments. The second characteristic is an unspoken rule that you only follow what's on paper. Too often I've seen that documentation is created to both create systems of power while also devaluing new ideas. And one example of that is if documentation exists that outlines structure, policy, or practices, then by default you have to obey it. But on the flip side, if a document doesn't exist, its very lack of existence is used to devalue what might be a new idea, a good practice, or when accountability might need to be pulled to the forefront because accountability might be needed in some instances. But because it's not on paper, it's automatically dismissed. And I also see that positions that are in communication roles internally and externally are much more highly valued. And this also shows up as, sometimes as a limited way in thinking, almost going back to that homogenous thought that might exist within an organization. A third characteristic that I wanted to share and point out is condescendence, right? The way that this might show up in an organization includes decisions being made within the institutions that only those with power understand the rationale why. Decisions are often made for those without authority or power, but also done without their viewpoints being considered. And as a result, those with less power don't always have a clear understanding or who makes decisions and why they're making them. I have seen this many of times where organizations make decisions that have implications on the volunteers, and the volunteers have not at all been consulted or informed about this decision until it's already done. The last one that we'll cover is the idea of false dichotomy. This can show up in the organization where we work and support as the creation of a good or bad, right? It's either you're with us or you're against us. This sometimes will create an idea that you can't do both, or that you can't have more than two possible outcomes. There's also an oversimplification of very complex issues. And this may be the result of an environment that actually forces people to make hasty decisions. It is sometimes created by this false or forced sense of urgency that prevents people from actually taking the real time necessary to consider any alternative views. And in a nonprofit sector, the alternative view that I've seen especially criticized are those that require more resources to accomplish successfully. And just think about this hypothetical question. How many times in a nonprofit sector or within that structure are people discouraged from choosing the better option because it requires getting more resources, i.e. more donations or financial capital? So as a result, the decision is actually made hastily to pursue the less effective, more cost-efficient option. And so that's something I'm always trying to be more cognizant of. But beyond that, even the words that we use in a nonprofit sector, they matter. Generally speaking, within the philanthropic sector at large, institutions, we talk about serving disadvantaged communities, quote unquote, disadvantaged. Unfortunately, communities often described as, quote, disadvantaged are predominantly low income Black and Brown citizens that have less social capital and financial security. Even the mere words that we use actually have a negative impact on the communities that we're serving in and engaging as volunteers. There is a slide at the very end. It's a resources slide. There are several resource slides, but within the resources slide, I actually list an article, and it's called Careless Labels Like Underserved Ignore the Richness Diversity Among Blacks. And it's an opinion piece that was written in a Miami Herald, and it speaks to how language often used in the nonprofit sector can actually undermine the very work that we're trying to accomplish. Within the first paragraph, the author's name is Carlton Ford, he writes, quote, "I am not underserved, I am not underrepresented, I am Black. Underserved, underrepresented, these terms are commonly used shorthand in nonprofit and for-profit circles to indicate minority communities. I must admit, as a nonprofit professional, I too have used this language with well-meaning intentions, but it begs the question, do these terms express or suggest white supremacy at the expense of Black communities?" End quote. And when I think about blind spots, I have, using myself as an example, I have used that very language before and I have not put enough thought in that moment in time to understand that I could be negatively impacting the work that I've been trying to do. And I would say that the author, again, he's right. At large, the nonprofit sector, they make billions based on model that serves these very communities. Yet these same communities don't always have a voice or say so in these same organizations. And the next thing that I'll just sort of flag that's on this slide is that as we continue through this presentation, you'll see that I have call outs for what I would consider recommended readings. In this case and on this slide, I actually recommend 2 books. I've read both of them, Blind Spot, Hidden Biases of Good People, and Subtle Acts of Exclusion, How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. All the recommended reading will, again, be on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. Now, when we're thinking about language and how we're talking and communicating internally and externally, I'm going to go back to the Sierra Club as an example. The Sierra Club, even before their self-reckoning, they were working to create a more inclusive environment through the tools that empower and equip their staff, chapters, organizational practices, their volunteers. And one example that I have here on this slide, and this is a publicly available document, it's in 2018, Sierra Club, they authored and published a nearly 30-page document called Equity Language Guide. And this practice of scrutinizing language and communications, this goes back to several additional practices of anti-racism. One being self-education through constant thirst of knowledge, reading books, even those that I've suggested on this slide, and actively unlearning phraseology and terminology that may cause unintended harm through microaggressions or undermining the work that you're championing around inclusivity. And then purging that from your vocabulary organizationally. The last thing I'll share about these books again is that both books were great in helping even me understand the blind spots that I hold and how my language through the work that I do could be harmful and even perpetuate white supremacy culture, even as a man of color. So I've always found these books are incredibly good. All right, so how many times, and this is a rhetorical question, but how many times have we seen an image like this associated with the act of volunteering? Many hands, hearts, stars, etc., people hugging, smiling. There's a ton of research that does suggest that volunteers not only support institutions that serve communities, but they also benefit greatly from connecting with others along with the critical issues that they're working to solve. Volunteers, they benefit from feeling more socially connected and a sense of purpose in life. Volunteerism even opens up opportunities for communities closed off from employment. There's just one issue with all this, and it's that volunteering requires a fair degree of privilege. While volunteering, is a consensual endeavor, it's not inevitably inclusive. And what I mean by this is that the burden of volunteering can actually disproportionately disadvantage more those who may already be vulnerable. It can stretch their limited time, their capacity, and the resources to the point of them breaking. Some common barriers to volunteering can actually include work commitments. Those working 2 or more jobs as an hourly employee to make ends meet, they have less time. Childcare and other household commitments remove even more time from that person, and chances are, if they are working more than 1 job, they may actually be considered the working poor. They might not have the means for childcare or to provide for their child if they're absent. If that same individual also relies on public transportation or has to incur additional expenses associated with simply making volunteering accessible, then they're just far less likely to volunteer. All right, so think about it in these terms. Those with less privilege also live with social exclusion. Social exclusion is when people suffer from a series of problems such as unemployment, discrimination, poor skills, low income, poor housing, high crime, and a family breakdown. It's essentially the limited access to normative behaviors of a given society. And this is caused by unequal power economically, politically, socially, and culturally. And like employment, volunteering requires a certain social and monetary investment that's not accessible to some. Similarly, those who live with social exclusion also have less social capital as people. And this means that they have less ability to secure benefits through membership-based organizations or other social networks or social structures. Research suggests that people with high levels of social capital are more likely to volunteer because they have more contact with entities that provide opportunities to volunteer. And this is certainly true oftentimes with social clubs, membership-based organizations, places of work, higher education institutes, and fraternal organizations. Unfortunately, these very institutions are not accessible by many. And additionally, and very much interconnected with this, is everything mentioned here requires a fair amount of human capital as a person. And what I mean by human capital is higher levels of education and skills to access social capital. And the relationship between human capital and volunteering is actually thought to be mutually reinforcing. Human capital, it encourages volunteering, and volunteering generates further human capital. And lastly, there's, of course, economic capital. Generally, those with higher economic capital have also been linked to higher levels of volunteering. And while higher levels of economic capital give greater avenues and opportunity to volunteer, with the increase of income inequality, there's actually been a noticeable decrease in volunteering. And so here's the last thing I'm going to share, and then we'll continue. But if a majority of America's nonprofit organizations are led and overwhelmingly managed by white people, and the very communities they are seeking to support are considered disadvantaged, those same communities being largely low-income Black and Brown communities, also having less access to forms of volunteering as a result, then we have to do more as a sector to tip the scales to make the landscape more just. Because what I'm seeing is that people of color are not at the decision-making table, nor are they able to be involved with the very organizations that make decisions for them, advocate for them, and do work on their behalf. So, we talked about the centuries old and the centuries of old social and cultural ideals that might be influencing the very structures we work. I'd also be naive in suggesting that these forces are easily counteracted. That being said, I do believe it's up to us to get beyond some of these barriers because they could be undermining, again, the very work that we're doing in the communities. What I do suggest include some actions, and I'm going to share some of them now, but we're going to talk about this in the latter half in greater detail. I believe working within our profession of volunteer engagement and community advocacy to hire from more diverse communities can be a part of the solution. I also believe diversity has to exist within our field, which we'll cover here in more detail. Secondly, we should also seek to engage more diverse communities in volunteering with the organizations where we work. We talked a little bit about how the communities we seek to advocate for may not have a seat at the decision-making table, but just as bad, they're also not able to participate in the organizations that work on their behalf. So that has to change. And the last piece that we'll discuss is power brokers and the role that power brokers or those in leadership positions play in assisting us in this change. And again, this all requires a fair degree of rigor. And again, by no means will folks be experts by the end of this, but these, again, are great starting points in my opinion. All right, so first things first, I'm going to share personally that, as someone who works in both corporate responsibility and in the nonprofit sector, too often do I go to conferences, summits, and discussions, and I actually don't see Black, Brown, or Indigenous people of color. And this is just my own personal observation, but I feel like the populations being served through the mechanisms that engage volunteers aren't at all represented by our profession. To add to this, and according to the 2021 Volunteer Management Progress Report, which was published by Volunteer Pro, and I actually just downloaded it yesterday and read through it, which is fantastic, and I would encourage everybody else to do the same. But according to this 2021 report, 83% of respondents self-identified as being white or European descent in the race and ethnicity column. And while I couldn't find any demographic data through a search on professionals in corporate responsibility, I suspect that it's very similar. We have to seek to change this. And while I suspect this might be very difficult if we're not in a dual role within human resources or as a hiring manager who's making that decision on who's hired to engage volunteers, I do think that there are other things that we can certainly do as a profession. And this goes back to the practice of always be recruiting, even when a position for paid staff or a volunteer isn't available, and constantly looking to elevate voices, and the talent from communities of color. One thing that we must do more of is mentor Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color who are in volunteer engagement. Help encourage them to stay within the field or to continue championing it. Help them excel on the ladder of leadership to positions of greater influence. And, frankly, there are a handful of volunteer engagement professionals who are doing a great job at this. Faiza Vincent, the new executive director of CCVA, does a fantastic job at this. Nicole Smith, who's hosting and moderating this, also does a fantastic job at this of elevating voices of people of color, including my own, right? And so we have to do more of that. We also have to be more actively engaged in our DOVIAs or volunteer administrators associations or organizations like Alive. Alive, they're in their second year of having a formalized mentorship program, which I'm a part of. And when we were doing our orientation some months ago, I was very pleasantly surprised to see that there are other people of color as both mentors and mentees. And I think that we have to continue championing those type of opportunities. We also have to be more actively engaged with job-seeking aged youth. And when I say youth, I mean the ages of 16 to 24. These are job-seeking age individuals. We have to remove stigma or any misunderstanding that exists around our profession. We have to be the conduit between young professionals and our field. And as it pertains to our everyday work, we also have to stay very curious in our pursuit to understand our own biases, blind spots, and how we can continue to stay educated to not perpetuate racial injustices through our work. And the last thing I'll mention is this, regardless of where each of you are on your social impact journey, as someone as an AmeriCorps or AmeriCorps alum or other national service, or perhaps within your organization as a volunteer engagement professional or subject matter expert, we have to be aware of our own professional makeup and how that's actually affecting the work that we are doing long term. And hopefully long term, many of us will stay in the field, whether it's nonprofit or governmental sector, or even taking a liking to corporate responsibility like I did, and doing the work just from a different angle, and then continuing the work that we're doing in our various sectors. Now, beyond ourselves and our own profession, again, we have to also continue to take inventory of our own structures, those we work within and others that we manage and even create. We have to remove any barriers that may prevent those with less social, human, and economic capital from participating in our organizations. It may not be immediately understood by some, but diverse communities sometimes need to see others that look like them volunteering at our organizations before they choose to volunteer themselves. If our volunteer pool or a volunteer corps is homogenous, it may actually communicate to others that this isn't an organization that they can be a part of. Now, understanding that, we have to seek to create a more actively applied DEI strategy for our own volunteers. The first step, again, in my opinion, is to overcome some of this. We have to get beyond this idea that we're already well off simply because we're able to satisfy the staffing needs that we have. Too often do I hear people say, oh, well, nonprofit organizations, they should just be happy with what they get. And honestly, I think that's false. Settling is often never first place, and it's often never the best option. So we mustn't settle. In my full-time role at Marriott, I would always hear our chairman of the company, Mr. Bill Marriott Jr., and he would always say, success is never final. And it's because of that deep-rooted value of always striving to do more, because there's always a better way to be more successful. We have to apply that same idea to the work that we do. It's not enough that we can just fill our volunteer opportunities if those that we're filling the opportunities with only create or perpetuate a homogenous organization. And the last thing I'll say is that, while DEI strategies are not new in circles within human resources or talent acquisition teams, I'm always really amazed on how many nonprofit professionals think it's a foreign concept to apply DEI principles within volunteer engagement. But when you really think about it in terms of who's engaging the most, who's engaging the most people at a majority of our nonprofits, it begins to make more sense why DEI is so important. And here's what I mean by that. Most volunteer engagement professionals that I know, they engage more people than the average HR professional engages. So to me, DEI is vital within volunteer engagement. So where do we start? I think that's probably the question that we've been leading up to. My answer would be to start with where your volunteer program creates levels of access to different populations. And here's what I mean by that. So before COVID-19, I'd argue that virtual volunteerism was largely ignored compared to the attention that it's really getting now. With millions of people now adopting virtual means to connect, it's actually created in some ways more opportunity to reach populations that wouldn't otherwise give their time as volunteers. People are volunteering from the comforts of their home during times of the day that they'd otherwise not be available because now they are adopting virtual means that are being offered by nonprofits. Now, what this means for nonprofit organizations, of course, is that if virtual means can satisfy a portion of your mission, and if you have the capacity to do so, then it would be in the best interest of an organization to create opportunities that are virtual or hybrid in nature, simply because this is creating the ability to reach populations of people that otherwise wouldn't have access to in-person volunteering. Just understand, it's a double-edged sword, right? So on the flip side, we also have to understand that not everybody has the same access to the internet. COVID-19, I think, has really uncovered more disparities or the deepness of disparities in the communities where we are seeking to serve people and may even be seeking to engage them as volunteers. It's uncovered the lack of access to virtual means and the internet. So we just have to also be very conscious of that. So if you're seeking to connect with Black, Brown, or Indigenous communities of color that don't have the same access to the internet, what that means is that not only can they not access virtual volunteer opportunities, but perhaps they're not even seeing your recruitment messages or call to actions, that they're missing those. And if this community you're seeking doesn't have consistent internet access or lacks digital literacy, then your social media posts, your emails, your e-newsletters, your ads, your press releases, all these different communiques are being missed. And so what that means is that, for many organizations who are trying to connect with these communities that have a digital divide, then perhaps you have to really enhance what most political campaigns would call their ground game. It means that you'll have to do a greater job at campaigning physically. Go within these communities, visit these communities at their community centers, visit their places of worship, going door to door, standing on street corners or heavily trafficked areas and passing out flyers and physically connecting with folks. And I understand that COVID-19 is a big barrier from actually connecting within these communities, but that's something to think about for the next normal as we head into 2021. But before you start to really implement that strategy to more deliberately connect with these communities, again, do your research. You have to determine very specifically their socioeconomic status, their pain points, how they best receive communication, their value systems, all of that. And I think only once the research is done, then you can really act to create mechanisms of outreach that connect with those that you're seeking, but really where they need to be met. All right, so part of these barriers may include the cost to volunteer. Earlier, we talked about privilege being needed to volunteer. That includes social, human, and economic capital. So we just have to acknowledge that and also bring those costs to the forefront as we're creating our volunteer opportunities. It's simple. I think the more it costs financially to engage someone in giving their time, the less likely they are to participate. And so there are some things that, that we can have to really start to think about when we're creating our volunteer opportunities. For example, the time of day in which the opportunity takes place. If it's during a workday, that actually might limit who accepts the task. You might have to forego working professionals or those with commitments from morning to evening. Those working 2 or more jobs who might be considered the working poor, or those who are hourly employees, they might be immediately excluded. For some, they might have to make a choice between earning a wage or taking the day off without pay. Others may take PTO, but then potentially leaving them without enough PTO if they get sick. And so these are real considerations that people have to start to make if a volunteer opportunity is positioned during working hours. And unfortunately, too few employers will allow employees to volunteer during working hours unless it's sponsored by their company. Secondly, we have to also think about whether or not the opportunity is during a time of day where a family would gather for breakfast or dinner, or perhaps a would-be volunteer has a young child to tend to. Many volunteer opportunities are not suitable for young children, right? And in these instances, a mother or father may have to line up a babysitter or another form of childcare. But if a family is unable to afford childcare, then that might force that family in a position to either decline the opportunity or to seek to bring that child with them. And some things that I've seen nonprofits do is to have on-site childcare for families in those instances that the volunteer opportunity isn't suitable for young children. Sometimes the volunteer opportunity is family friendly, but I know that that's not the case in a lot of instances based on the mission and the programming. Even the location that is chosen has implications. If a volunteer relies on public transportation, that's not only an additional cost, but you also have to think about the greater burden of time if they're waiting for a bus, a metro, a train, a taxi, or another ride-sharing app. In some instances, the location may be remote or longer distance, requiring the volunteer to rent a vehicle at their expense, or perhaps lodging is in some instances where the distance is so far that overnight stay is the safest way to participate. If a venue that's chosen for volunteers, requires parking, those volunteers with their personal vehicles, we have to be thoughtful in that parking situation. I've seen too often where the parking at a location to volunteer is $5, $10. Here in the metropolitan DC area, you might be paying $25 to park simply to volunteer because the event is being hosted at a hotel or an expo or another convention center. And in addition to this, I've also seen that volunteers oftentimes have to pay for food, and that can get incredibly costly. So here's what all this has to do with creating a more diverse and inclusive volunteer opportunity. Economic capital can oftentimes be one of the biggest barriers to engaging communities that are historically marginalized, those that live in poverty, or those in a community that receives support from your organization. And so if we're to create opportunities for the communities that we're serving to have a say-so in or be involved in our organizations, and we have to really determine how do we remove those economic barriers that exist. The bottom line is that when people have to make a choice, they often have to address their own needs first before making a choice to serving others. And so we have to be conscious to not put volunteers in a position of choosing between themselves and those they'd like to support through our programs. And so we're going to talk about that here next. So I suspect that much of these barriers that I talked about are logistical, material, or digital in nature. That said, I also believe that there are many of these can actually be solved for financially. And I'm not the person that's going to say money's going to solve all the problems, because we know that they don't. But I think in these instances, that's something that can really support removing some of these economic barriers. And I know that's not easy, right? I know that's not an easy answer because the mechanisms that are needed to engage volunteers are oftentimes the least funded, underfunded, or not funded at all by strategic philanthropy. So as we talk about this and we get into the next segment and we talk about power brokers, we're going to talk about that in terms of development and, getting their allyship in this. All right, so when we talk about some of these gaps that exist around logistics and parking, one of the things that I've seen that works is getting your development department, your development team involved, working with sponsors. And this is really to create stipends, right? Stipends for parking or transportation to and from the opportunity. In instances where parking is an expense, I have seen where it's worked, where you work with a venue to provide free or validated parking. I've also seen that in some instances that providing a shuttle or working with a ride-sharing app to provide a discount for participants has also helped bridge some of those gaps. In instances where a family or parent has a small child and otherwise couldn't participate unless they had childcare, I have seen where an organization will work with the venue or service provider to provide on-site childcare for participants. And instances where the time of the day might be a barrier, then you might have to seek to change the time of the day that actually helps to create greater accessibility for the community that you're seeking to engage. This can also be said for meals. I've also seen that at convention centers, large events, and conferences, the on-site meals are incredibly expensive and also don't allow for outside food to be brought in. And so in these instances, you might have to provide that meal stipend or work to provide lunch through an authorized eatery. And all of these, again, they come at an expense. So it's really important to communicate these as being potential barriers that may only allow a certain minority of volunteers who have privilege to support your organization. This all being said, though, these are tangible items that we're talking about. But there are certainly intangible items that are rooted in social, cultural, and religious ideals, which we will talk about here next. All right, so in the work that I do at Marriott International, I've always been presented with the challenge of working with diverse communities as a global company. We're in 144 countries and territories. And so one of the things that I always share with people is that our Western value of volunteerism, it's not universally understood across the globe. Unlike some of our Western counterparts, namely those in the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, while our values are similar, we have a more diverse nation, which creates a situation where the very people that we're seeking to engage as volunteers don't always carry the same values of volunteerism. And here's what I mean. Here in the United States, we have to be aware and acknowledge that the act of giving one's time for free can still be considered taboo or strongly discouraged. In some nations and cultures, it's seen as wrong for a man to give their time. And it's believed that these things are drawn by gender lines where the act of volunteerism is limited to women. Even the word volunteer doesn't exist in some languages. So if we're working with international or diverse populations, we also just have to understand the language that we're using. I have seen volunteerism described as human capital engagement in languages that volunteerism does not exist. One resource that I would actually point out, and is also in the resource slide, is the United Nations Volunteer State of World's Volunteerism Report. It's very lengthy, but it actually does a great job at highlighting some of the cultural nuances that might actually deter would-be volunteers here in America. All of these reasons, of course, to me, underscore the importance of even creating language that helps people value what we're creating a call to action around. For example, a peer of mine who works in corporate responsibility for Best Buy, she actively creates cultural competency training for both her employees as she's seeking employees as volunteers internally, and also as they are going outwards into the community and connecting with those that they're serving. Similar to Sierra Club, you might also wish to create tools that equip and empower not only organizational staff, but also the volunteers who might often work side by side with other volunteers or members of the community. Last month, I was having a conversation with a volunteer engagement professional who works in the Northeast, and she shared a story about a volunteer who she knew who openly admitted to not volunteering at a specific food bank. And she didn't want to volunteer at this food bank because she was uncomfortable about the idea of having to confront her own privilege as a result of potentially volunteering alongside members of the community who were served by that very same food bank. And the only thing that was stopping her, in my opinion, was her not feeling equipped for that situation. And I believe in order to build empathy between diverse groups of people who may otherwise see themselves as the out group, we have to cross-pollinate. And I believe that perhaps the training for this would-be volunteer would have helped get her over that hurdle. And while that's speculation, I have to believe that that would have helped in some regard. So, everything I'm describing, it takes a lot of work. It's an investment of both time and money and requires a fair degree of intellectual curiosity. What I always recommend is that you seek and continue to seek everything you can about the diverse communities you're engaging in volunteerism. Just remember that while you're on this quest for knowledge, it doesn't have to be done on your own. Seek counsel from outside subject matter experts who can help assist in the creation of curriculum, communication, training necessary to bridge some of those cultural divides. One practice that I've seen is working to create partnerships with education institutes who might be able to offer training or curriculum, or companies that either already specialize in cultural training or can offer it in gratis or pro bono. Many Fortune companies and even the Department of Defense have employee readiness groups, diversity and inclusion councils, and have been doing much of this work for some time now. And of course, many of these companies also have their own blind spots. But I think that over this past year, what we have seen is that many of these have been acknowledging their own blind spots. Just know that you might be able to leverage those in education and in a for-profit sector to support some of these initiatives. Now, all of this, of course, in my opinion, is with the end goal to create a forum of greater cultural understanding for both those you employ and engage in volunteerism. Ultimately, to me, I think it'll help in your mission deliverables come long term. All right, so I know that we're coming short on time. I think we have about 17 minutes. So rather than pausing, I'm going to get through the next 6 or so slides, and we will open up for Q&A.
That's great, Jerome. This is Gretchen. We do have some questions, so power through.
Okay. All right, will do. Thank you. All right, so briefly recapping, we discussed the following. We talked about, in the first portion of the presentation, we talked about invisible forces that might be undermining your volunteer engagement due to centuries-old social and cultural ideals. We talked about some actions, or we talked about white supremacy and how that might influence some of your programmatics, your policies, and the very way that you engage volunteers, simply because of a homogenous environment that exists. We also talked about some of the barriers that exist with those, or from those, or for those who have less social, human, and economic capital. And then we also talked about some ways to overcome some of those barriers, both financially and programmatically. And we also talked about some cultural barriers. Now, in this last section, we're going to talk about power brokers. Power brokers, again, these are folks that are in leadership positions, those who make decisions on fundraising, and even those who govern the organization. They too have to be a part of this DEI and anti-racism conversation. It has to be important to them for the work to get done. All right, so we must work to create a consensus, in my opinion, amongst our leaders. I think it is always difficult unless that leader decides to act first. We know this isn't always the case. So here's what I suggest and what I've seen work. Start dialogue, build allyship with those who are close to you within your institutions. There's a saying, to never let a good crisis go to waste. And right now we're in a crisis racially. So connect with those you consider colleagues and friends, those you trust. This can be others with similar clout and responsibility that in your place of work as peers. This may even include close and influential volunteers within your organization. Explain to them why diversity and inclusion and working to change what may be considered racist practices within the organization must change. When you have allies, the ability to influence more broadly, it becomes much easier. It's much harder for leadership to say no when there's a groundswell of support from their direct reports, from volunteers, and even potential donors. Once you have consensus on who you've talked with organizationally on the actions to take, now it's time to start to explain the importance of leadership. Of course, you know your leadership better than I do, but in many instances, I've seen that you'll want to control your emotions. These are emotionally charged conversations, and oftentimes, don't be brash or insulting. Talk in private. The last thing that you'll want to do is to call out anybody in a way that's insulting or paints a negative picture on those in leadership for what might be considered complicity or a lack of action. There's a book that I recommend. It's called Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When Stakes Are High. I've read and reread this book multiple times when trying to push through proposals, when having conversations about salary raise, promotions. And these are all emotionally charged conversations, right? When talking to them, let them know that you and others that you've built consensus with want to have greater action for DEI and dismantling what might be considered structural racism. Just be sure that you've done all your research on the invisible forces that might be at play, what you'd like to change, and ultimately how that might create a more positive outcome for the organizational staff, your volunteers, and ultimately the community that you're engaging. And then you'll also want to make sure that this is the same conversation that you have with your development team, as they're incredibly influential, especially with donors. And last but not least, if you're seeking to create change, you'll want to work to create a data collection plan to track and measure your progress. This way, just like your programs and organizational theory of change, you can track and measure the inputs, activities, outputs, and immediate or long-term outcomes. And similarly, again, you don't have to do this on your own. Just be sure as you're working that you're working from a baseline of information. The data that you track, it will also be a proof point for funders and other power brokers that may have otherwise been skeptical or are currently skeptical. Now, beyond engaging your volunteers in efforts to bring greater diversity to your volunteer corps and perhaps tracking that, there are other things that you can certainly do. What I suggest is to consistently collect information that helps identify how your volunteers are feeling. Simply tracking the numbers of how many people are engaging in their various demographics won't create an inclusive environment by itself. And so, we talked about everything from language, how people are communicated with, if there are ladders to positions of leadership. So, remember to also ask how your volunteers are feeling, whether the policies are working for them, if the mechanisms created through communication are in fact inclusive. If they, the volunteer feel as though they have a place in your organization, or if they don't, I suspect that if the surveying and the town hall sessions are being done well, you will get the answer on what you need to change and how you need to change it, especially for the communities that you might be seeking. And then the last thing I'll just share, and I would be remiss by if I didn't say this, but volunteering to me is one of the greatest, strongest forms of democracy. And we're just beyond a presidential election here in America, and so we have to remember that with our and others' time, we can actually place a vote on the causes and the values that we hold close, regardless of who's in office. And this is certainly true when we're talking about creating more just and diverse societies. I encourage people to make that personal investment in the causes that they care for, whether this is informal, like protesting, marching, and other forms of activism, or whether it's through formalized institutions. I also encourage organizations to more fully invest in policy creation that helps contribute to more racially just environments. That being said, in order for volunteerism to be a form of democracy, it also has to be accessible by those being served. Because of that, it's important to those being, it's important that those who are being served are also able to access both the decision-making table and the opportunities to volunteer with the very organizations that might be serving them. And it starts by making your organizations more accessible, more inclusive. And this isn't about perfection. To me, this is about the continued goal of more progress. And that's the conclusion of the presentation. I know that we flew through this. This is recorded. This is the first resources slide. Again, there are 3 resources or resource slides. These are the books that I had mentioned. And this is a video that we didn't get to watching. It's an 8-minute video by Chris Jarvis. Many of you guys know him, about transformative volunteering and removing implicit bias through the act of purposeful volunteering. It's a great video if you've not seen this one. And this is how you can connect with me beyond today, and I would certainly encourage that. All right, back to you, Nicole.
All right, man. Oh, man. Oh, man. Thank you so much. There was so much to unpack. I'm going to dive right in. There's a couple of questions. Gretchen and I are going to try to shoot them off to you as fast as we can. One of them was in terms of volunteer boards. It was Joanna Scott. She asked in terms of volunteer boards in order to help diversify them, would it be a good idea to ask like sitting members from local associations to sit on their boards to help to diversify?
Yeah, and one of the things that I've actually seen work, and I think there are a couple different things that can be done. I've seen that some organizations have made very strong decisions to have people voluntarily leave the board, right? If there are maybe 12 board seats, then perhaps that organization can say, you know what, we are going to ask that, we have some members step away from the board to allow for new blood from very diverse communities. I've also seen some boards just add more members to sort of even that playing field and to elevate those voices. I've also seen some organizations very deliberately connect with those that they're serving and elevating their voice on having a board seat, right? So they have a member of the community that's being served as a board member for that organization as representation for those that are being served. And I've seen all 3 of those ideas work great.
Hi, Jerome, it's Gretchen. So my question is about, sometimes you hear the term, besides DEI, you hear DEAI, and the A is for accessibility. So, within this context, just like to know your thoughts. I mean, there's a lot of words and acronyms out there, and we could go on all day probably, but briefly.
Yeah, I guess, and I think the trap that I think a lot of us get stuck in, and I do the same thing, is we start to, and of course words matter, but I think we start to get so wrapped around the axle on what acronym we're using, when I think the accessibility part, the A in there, can actually be accomplished when we talk about equity, because what we're talking about is we're talking about evening the playing field by providing greater access to those who don't have the same social, economic, and human capital, right? The same access. And so, I'm going to use Marriott International as an example. We went from talking about diversity and inclusion, and now we're talking about it as diversity, equity, inclusion. Of course, some of the things that we have done have changed, but rather than getting wrapped around the axle and saying DI, DNI, or DEI, or DEAI, I think we should really be focused more on the actions and what those words embody in action.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question. And I believe it was actually by Joanna Scott again. I think it's down here at the beginning. She says, she's developing a new program for volunteers from the ground up. What is the most effective way to track how they are feeling regularly? Do you have a suggestion for how frequently this should occur for a new program or an established program? And then also, would that also apply to interns as well?
So I think the way that an organization, I'm gonna address the intern thing first, because I think sometimes people say, oh, well, they're unpaid interns, so they're volunteers, right? I think that's an organizational decision. I've seen organizations that say, well, the interns, that's HR's job, paid or unpaid, and then volunteers are the volunteer engagement professional's job. At some point, I think there has to be some sort of cohesion between both, right? So the right hand's talking to the left hand, but I think that's an organizational decision. When we're talking about surveying people, what I've seen works great. Baseline information first, right? I think it's always great to start a baseline with canvassing everybody with all the same questions. I think after that, I think it's always great to do an annual survey for some of the more in-depth questions. So that way you can see what progress you're making based on the same questions year over year over year. But I would also say that there are a couple ways you can do this, right? I think you can always ask the volunteers, how much is too much? How often do they want to be asked about these things, about their feelings, about how they're feeling about the organization? I think they'll tell you, they'll be like, yeah, I think once a quarter is fine, or maybe they'll say biannually. But I also think that the other thing that you can do is you can always, ask experientially based questions that are more short-term based post-event, right? Because when you create your single traditional episodic volunteer opportunity, if it's like a single day of service or something, you will have went through that whole process of communicating, recruiting, orienting, training, onboarding. And so you will have went through that full life cycle for a single event, where at the very end, of course, I think it's always a good idea to ask experience questions. How did you feel about this? How was the communication? Was it inclusive? Yada, yada, yada. And I think people will resonate with that on a more frequent basis versus maybe an annual, longer term, more robust survey. That is a baseline that you track year over year.
Fabulous. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I know I personally have so many questions, so I know I'm going to be hitting you up in the LinkedIn group for real, because there's and so I encourage everybody, please. And let me tell you, that's how I met Jerome. Actually, I was getting ready for a diversity webinar, and I was like, Jerome, I had no idea who he is. I just called him up and was like, can you help me? And he was so gracious. He found time in his schedule, helped me out. So I'm telling you, reach out to him. Do not feel like he is untouchable, because he is really here to help all of us. So drop those questions in there. And so I just want to close out with a couple of announcements so that we can make sure that we're on time. Just a reminder that the January member newsletter did go out. So definitely check your spam folder, because it's happened to me a couple of times. Save the date for the Alive member welcome webinar, which is the 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. Our February Alive Academy, which is No One Right Way, Imagining New Systems for Volunteer Engagement, presented by Lisa Joycelyn. And then on March 3rd, our Alive Academy, 1 p.m. Eastern, will be Navigating Difficult Situations,
Effective Solutions for Everyday Challenges, presented by Beth Steinhorn. And if you would like to have the opportunity to present for the Alive Academy, we have started this program. You can go on the Alive website and you can apply to do so. And we also have committee positions open for membership, marketing, programs, and advocacy. Check the newsletter. There's so much going on, so much good stuff. Please go and visit us at volunteeralive.org. It will not be a waste of your time. You're gonna just get so many golden nuggets. And Jerome, I have to thank you. I mean, if I would stand up and give you a standing ovation, but then you wouldn't see me and be all awkward. But thank you for taking the torch and leading the way and just opening eyes and giving tools for people who really just have a lot of questions. So thank you so much for your time today. I know you have a hard stop, so I want to be able to let you go. And Gretchen, is there anything else that we need to talk about?
We are good. I will end the presentation and thank Jerome again very, very much, and have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right, take care, and thank you again for being great hosts.
Thank
All right.
you.
Bye-bye.